I'm Olivia, and for years my family saw me as nothing more than an afterthought. Every Christmas, their laughter was a stark reminder of my place on the outside with my little handmade gifts. They thought I was garbage, believing they had won. But what happens when the person they dismissed holds a secret that can bring down their entire world? What happens when a little gift becomes a symbol of power? This Christmas, a gift was mocked, a line was crossed, and for the first time I promised myself I would get the justice I deserve. Walking into my parents' house that Christmas night felt like stepping onto a stage. The scent hit me first: roast duck, expensive wine, the crisp pine from the tree in the corner. It was beautiful, yes, but suffocating. Every piece of silverware gleamed as if polished just for the occasion. The crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier, lined up like soldiers on parade. My mother had created not a home but a performance, and we, her children, were the actors. I came carrying something small. My gift didn't glitter like the others. It wasn't wrapped in shiny foil or tied with a bow from a designer store. It was a dark walnut box I had carved myself, my hands shaping every line, my tools cutting every pattern. Inside, I had fitted tiny lights arranged to glow like a galaxy when switched on. I wanted it to be more than a gift. I wanted it to show a part of me that no one in that house had ever cared to see. I placed it gently on the table, almost hoping it might go unnoticed. But Ethan, my older brother, never let anything I did slip by without comment. He lounged in his chair, wine already painting his cheeks red, his wristwatch flashing under the chandelier. He reached for the box before my father could bless the meal. The paper tore quickly under his hands, his movements exaggerated for effect. He held the box up, turning it like it was some cheap trinket. His smile widened into a sneer. "Really, Olivia? This is what you brought?" His voice grew louder. "A little craft project. This gift is garbage. Did you pick it up from the dumpster?" The laughter came instantly. Sophie's giggle was shrill. My mother laughed, though it sounded forced, her eyes scanning the table for approval. Even my father shook his head, his face filled with the same tired pity I had seen 100 times before. Together they confirmed what I had always been in their eyes, the disappointment, the one they could mock freely. I sat still, letting the cold calm settle in. My silence not surrender, but a controlled defiance I had learned through years of their dismissal screamed louder than Ethan's words. He thought he was powerful, thought his words had cut me down. He didn't know he had just touched the edge of something much bigger. And then it happened. The laughter stopped, as if someone had cut a wire. Grace, Ethan's fiancée, had been silent all along. She hadn't joined in. She hadn't even looked up. Now her hands trembled where they rested on the white tablecloth. Slowly she lowered her head in a gesture that was strange, almost reverent. Her voice broke the silence, quiet, but unmistakable. "Boss? Why are you here?" The words landed like a thunderclap. Ethan froze, his smug grin collapsing into shock. His face drained of color, his jaw slack. "What did you just say?" he snapped, panic sharpening his tone. "That's not funny, Grace. Tell me you're joking." But Grace didn't answer. She kept her head lowered, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The word hung in the air like smoke, impossible to deny. "Boss." My father tried to smooth it over, but his voice faltered. "Grace, dear, you must have meant something else. Surely." Grace lifted her head, her face strained, her eyes darting nervously. "I misspoke," she said quickly. "I'm sorry. It's late, I'm tired." She wanted to take the word back, but it was too late. The damage was done. Ethan pointed at me, his hand shaking. "She's nothing. She's always been nothing. Grace, stop this nonsense." I didn't move. I lifted my glass slow and steady and took a sip. My silence, a steel wall, countered Ethan's frantic accusations. Around the table I could feel the shift. In their eyes I wasn't just the forgotten one anymore. I was something they couldn't explain. Grace whispered again, broken this time. "I'm sorry." But she wasn't looking at Ethan. She was apologizing to me. I set my glass down. I let a small smile curl across my lips as I looked straight at my brother. "Merry Christmas, Ethan." He glared at me. His face twisted with rage and something else, fear. I stood my chair, sliding back quietly, and walked away. Behind me, no one laughed. No one called me a failure. They only stared at the wooden box, the so-called garbage gift, now carrying a weight none of them understood. In that silence, the balance shifted. Power had left Ethan's hands, and I had no intention of giving it back. The silence after Grace's whisper clung to the air like smoke that refused to clear. A fork slipped, clattering onto a plate, with a sound that felt deafening. The chandelier's glow was too sharp now, turning every twitch and glance into a spotlight. I sat still, my fingers circling the rim of my glass wine, swirling lazily. Grace's slip had already cracked the mask Ethan wore, and the room knew it. Ethan was unraveling. My brother, always smug, always untouchable, looked suddenly small. His voice came out ragged. "Grace," he snapped, but it sounded like a plea. "Fix this. Say it was a joke. Say she's nothing." Grace shifted, pushing back her chair. Her lips parted. Olivia built. But Ethan's hand shot out, stopping her mid-breath. His glare silenced her. Everyone saw it. She had meant to speak, and he had forced her down. My father cleared his throat, trying to steady the room. "Grace," he pressed. "Did you call Olivia boss?" His authority cracked. My mother twisted her necklace, pale and unmoored. Sophie froze, fork in hand, staring at me like she didn't recognize me. I raised my glass slightly. "Merry Christmas." My voice was calm, but no one joined me. For the first time, their silence wasn't dismissal, it was recognition. Ethan slammed his palm on the table, rattling silverware. "This is a setup, Olivia. You've always been nothing. A scholar who failed. A woman living in a shoebox, pretending to matter." I let him rant. Every word tore at the image he had built, leaving him exposed. Grace sat, rigid, eyes lowered, but her silence was no longer passive. It was a refusal. My mother turned to me, voice thin. "Olivia, surely there's some explanation. Why would Grace say that?" I set my glass down. No explanations needed. Sometimes truth speaks for itself. That line shoved Ethan over the edge. He yanked Grace's wrist, making her flinch. "Say it. Tell them she was joking. Tell them she's worthless." Her face tightened, but she said nothing. That silence condemned him. I rose slowly. The scrape of my chair cut through the room. Every eye followed me. I leaned toward Ethan, my voice steady. "You don't need me to shame you. You're doing it yourself." My hand brushed the walnut box in the center of the table. "You dismiss what you don't understand. You call creation scraps because you've never built anything real." I pressed the hidden switch. Lights bloomed from within, scattering like a constellation across crystal and silver. Gasps rose. Sophie dropped her fork. My father leaned forward despite himself. My mother's lips parted in shock. Ethan sat frozen. His silence was louder than any denial. I closed the lid softly. Beauty is wasted on eyes too blind to see it. Then his phone buzzed violently. He snatched it, tilting it away, but Sophie caught the headline. Her sharp inhale betrayed him. I slipped on my coat. Before leaving, I looked back at Ethan, my words quiet, deliberate. "You won't laugh next Christmas." At the doorway, my phone buzzed. A new message glowed on the screen. "They're not ready for the truth, but soon they will know who you really are." I stepped into the winter night, leaving the stunned Harrison family frozen in place. The clink of silverware and the nervous whispers around the table faded until they were nothing but a faint hum. The golden chandelier above seemed too bright, almost mocking, as if it wanted to spotlight every secret hovering in the room. My gaze drifted to the walnut box, sitting at the center of the table, its carvings catching the light, and suddenly I wasn't in that grand dining room anymore. I was back in the cramped living room of my childhood, sitting cross-legged on a worn rug, watching another Christmas unfold. I was 7 that year. Ethan was 10. Snow had covered the yard outside, fresh and glittering like powdered sugar dusted over the world. Inside the tree was fake, its thin plastic needles falling and sticking to the carpet, a poor disguise for something we couldn't afford to replace. The house smelled faintly of mothballs and cheap cocoa. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. At least I thought it was. Dad had been teasing Ethan for weeks about a special surprise. And when the door opened to reveal a metallic red racing bike with a silver bow gleaming under the porch light, the world seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's face lit up, pure joy spilling from every pore. Cameras flashed. Mom clapped until her hands turned red. The room buzzed with pride as though the gift had been for all of them. I stood at the edge of it all, clutching a small package wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. Mom had pressed it into my hands earlier, with a distracted smile. "I knitted this for you, Olivia," she had said. "Keep warm, sweetheart." I peeled back the paper to reveal a scarf thick, uneven gray. It smelled of mothballs and her tired hands. I wanted to smile. I wanted to say thank you, but the sting was there. All I had asked for was a singing doll, the kind my friend next door had. Instead, I had yarn and silence. Ethan mounted his new bike, laughter ringing out as he carved tracks in the snow. "Be careful, son, it's brand new," Dad shouted, his voice booming with pride. Ethan circled the yard, his victory complete, while cousins and neighbors cheered him on. I stepped closer, scarf clutched in my hand, reaching out just to touch the handlebars to share a piece of his joy. But Ethan swerved sharply, cutting me off, his grin sharp as glass. "Don't even think about it, Liv. This isn't for you." His words hit harder than the cold air. Around us, uncles chuckled, cousins smirked. They thought it was a harmless sibling rivalry. To me, it was a public reminder of where I stood outside the circle, unwelcome. I turned away, clutching the scarf to my chest. Inside, the fake tree blinked unevenly, its cheap lights casting long, thin shadows across the wall. My shadow was small, stretched, forgotten in the corner. That night, lying in my narrow bed, I pressed the scratchy scarf against my face. Downstairs, Ethan's laughter echoed through the vents as he bragged into his brand new phone, already recounting the bike, the gifts, his glory. I buried my face into the yarn until it scraped my skin, hot tears soaking the rough wool. It wasn't disappointing anymore. It was understanding. They had chosen who to celebrate, and it wasn't me. In that small, dark room, I whispered a vow into the scarf. A vow no one heard but me. I will never let them look down on me again. The memory lingered as the dining room of the present came back into focus. The chandelier still glowed above, but I no longer felt its warmth. I glanced at Grace. Her bowed head trembled, her fingers pressed tight against the linen. I saw myself in her, the same shaking hands that once clutched a gray scarf, the same silence swallowing words too heavy to speak. But there was one difference. Back then, I was powerless. Tonight I wasn't. Ethan sat stiff in his chair, pretending control, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted nervously toward Grace, toward me, toward the box on the table, as if it might explode at any moment. My mother twisted her necklace so tightly, I thought the chain might snap. Sophie still hadn't moved, her fork hovering mid-air, her eyes wide, drinking it all in. I reached out slowly, deliberately, and let my hand rest on the walnut box. The carvings were smooth beneath my fingertips, grounding me. Across the table, Grace's eyes flickered up just for a second. Our gazes met, hers wide and fearful, mine steady. She looked away immediately, but it was enough. The silence thickened. No one knew what to say. No one dared move. And in that heavy pause, I felt the vow I once whispered into a moth-eaten scarf tighten around my chest, alive again. That vow had carried me through years of invisibility, through nights at a kitchen table turning scraps of wood into art, through every mocking word Ethan had ever thrown at me. I straightened in my chair, my hand still resting on the box. My voice was calm, almost gentle, but every word cut the silence. It's strange, isn't it, how gifts can show us who we really are? A bike, a scarf, a box, they all tell a story. Ethan flinched just barely, but I saw it. Grace's lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. My father shifted uncomfortably, his fork clattering against his plate. I let the moment stretch, savoring it. The difference, I added, my gaze fixed on Ethan, is that some gifts fade while others last forever. I withdrew my hand from the box and reached for my wine. The glass was cool in my grip. I raised it slowly, deliberately. "Merry Christmas." No one joined me. Not this time. But they didn't laugh either. They couldn't. The scarf of my childhood still burned in my memory, but the walnut box in front of me was proof that the circle I was once shut out of no longer mattered. The balance had shifted, and Ethan knew it. The air in the dining room was still heavy like a storm cloud that refused to pass. My hand brushed the walnut box resting on the table, the one Ethan had tossed around like it was nothing. He saw only scraps of wood. I saw years of work. I saw every night I sat hunched over a makeshift workbench in a cramped apartment, cutting sanding staining until my fingers ached. To him, it was a joke. To me, it was a prototype, the living proof that I had built something beyond his reach. Brain rot gifts didn't start with shiny offices or glossy magazines. It started in a Brooklyn walk-up where the kitchen table was my workshop and the air smelled like wood shavings and burnt coffee. Orders trickled in at first, cheap Etsy sales that barely covered rent. But I kept pushing. Word spread. One order became two. A stylist tagged my box in a photo spread. Then the magazines came calling. And then there was the day everything changed. I still remember standing in that drafty workshop in Vermont. The air smelled of varnish and cold metal. My team was small, then 2 part-time artisans and myself. We worked late radios humming quietly while we sanded hinges and tested lights. That was when a woman walked in, her coat still dusted with city snow. She introduced herself as Harper Lane, a buyer for a boutique in Soho that catered to international clients. She looked around the workshop, her heels clicking against the cement floor. I could tell she wasn't impressed at first. "This is it?" she asked, her voice, cool eyes scanning the half-finished prototypes. I expected something bigger. I smiled, though inside my stomach tightened. "It's not big," I told her, lifting one of the finished walnut boxes, "but it's precise. Every detail matters." I switched on the tiny lights inside. The glow spread like a miniature constellation, soft but deliberate, filling the dim space with quiet beauty. Harper's eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, running her manicured fingers along the carved edge. "And how long does it take you to make one of these?" 3 days, I said honestly. "But that includes testing sanding staining. We don't rush. Quality doesn't happen fast." She tapped the lid, her expression unreadable. "Most of my suppliers in Italy promise turnaround in 24 hours. I held her gaze steady. "Then maybe you should keep buying from them. But if you want something that lasts, something no machine can replicate, you'll understand why our clients wait." For a moment, the workshop went silent, except for the faint hum of the radio. My artisans paused their work, watching. Harper stood there, box in her hands, weighing it not just for what it was, but for what it represented. Finally, she exhaled softly. "How many can you deliver in 6 weeks?" I didn't hesitate. 200. Her brows lifted. "That's a bold promise." "It's not a promise," I corrected. "It's a commitment." She smiled faintly, tucked the box under her arm, and handed me her card. That order changed everything. The boutique showcased our pieces in their holiday window. Photos spread online, and suddenly my inbox was drowning in inquiries from Tokyo, London, Los Angeles. Back at the dinner table, I slipped my phone from my pocket. The screen lit up with a new notification: custom order $12,000, from Harper's Boutique. The glow reflected off my wineglass as I tapped to confirm. A quiet smile touched my lips. In a room full of people who dismissed me as irrelevant, my phone buzzed with proof that I wasn't. Ethan, desperate to pull attention back to himself, cleared his throat loudly. "Mom, Dad, let's be real. Olivia wastes her time on little crafts no one actually wants. Trinkets. I'm the one bringing in $1 million contracts, keeping this family afloat." His voice rang with fake confidence, but the cracks were showing. Dad frowned uneasy. "Ethan, not everyone needs finance to do well. People can succeed in different ways." Ethan barked a laugh. "Succeed with wooden boxes? You think Olivia pays her bills with this junk? She's irrelevant. A hobbyist. Always has been." He leaned forward, smirking at me, daring me to react. I didn't flinch. I didn't need to. Harper's contract, the international orders, the artisans whose livelihoods depended on me, they were all standing silently at my back. Every word Ethan spat only made him smaller. And then Grace spoke. Her voice was soft, but it sliced through his rant like glass. "Ethan, maybe you shouldn't say that." The table froze. My pulse stayed steady, but I felt the shift ripple through the room. Grace wasn't speaking to defend me out of kindness. She was protecting herself, her job, her secret. Ethan's head whipped toward her. What are you talking about? You're supposed to back me up. Grace's eyes stayed down. Her napkin twisted in her trembling hands. Brain rot isn't a hobby, she whispered. I've seen it mentioned in luxury market reports. It's bigger than you think. Silence followed. No one dared laugh now. The walnut box in the center of the table didn't look like trash anymore. It looked like proof. Ethan sputtered, searching for support. But the air had shifted. Authority had slipped from his grip, landing squarely on me. My phone buzzed again. Another email. I glanced at the subject line and my smile sharpened. Corporate inquiry, Harrison Holdings. While Ethan sneered while my parents fretted his own family's empire had unknowingly reached out to the company he called garbage. The irony was delicious, and the game had only just begun. The vibration in my pocket pulled me out of the heavy silence of the Christmas table. My phone screen glowed with an email, Harrison Holdings. Corporate inquiry. It was short, plain, but I knew exactly what it meant. They were knocking on the door of something they didn't understand, my company hidden behind layers of shells and quiet names. And sitting across from me was the man who had signed away the family's future without even realizing it. I remembered the day it happened. A Tuesday afternoon, gray skies pressing down on the city. My father sat in a wood-paneled office that smelled faintly of dust and polish, his tie pulled loose, his forehead lined with worry. Harrison Sr., the man who had always preached control and dominance, looked small that day. His big Connecticut real estate project had stalled. The banks refused his terms. Investors circled like vultures but demanded control clauses he wouldn't accept. And so he called me. The daughter he called a disappointment. The sister Ethan mocked openly. He didn't come to me for advice out of respect. He came because he was desperate, and because I had access to a network he didn't. I arranged the meeting. My binder was thick, neatly tabbed. The intermediary company I introduced looked legitimate, offices and Delaware lawyers on retainer, a name bland enough to slip past casual inspection. What my father didn't know was that every thread tied back to me. Ethan swaggered into the office beside him, jacket slung over his shoulder, sunglasses still perched on his head, as if the cloudy sky couldn't dim his arrogance. He leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, while I laid the documents out. "Let's not waste time, Olivia," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "Dad and I know what we're doing. We just need the money. Spare us the fine print." I let his words wash over me like I always did. I didn't argue. I simply turned to page 47, sliding it across the desk, my finger tapping lightly on a paragraph printed in careful legalese. "This section matters," I said softly. "Cross-collateral. It just means all properties secure one another. Standard clause." Dad didn't even adjust his glasses to read it properly. His eyes locked on the figure at the top of the contract, 7 figures, bold, promising salvation. "Looks fine," he said already, reaching for the pen. Ethan gave a quick laugh. "Exactly. Let's not make this complicated. Dad, sign it so we can get to the course before the rain starts." And he did. Pen scratching across paper, his name looping with a flourish. He leaned back, chest rising with pride. "This," he said, looking at me with a patronizing smile, "is how real business gets done. You keep playing with your little crafts." Ethan clapped him on the back, grinning as though they had just outsmarted the world. But buried in those lines was something far sharper than either of them understood. Not only were the properties tied together, but I had written in a cross-default clause. If Ethan or his firm, Lawson Inc., slipped up, if scandal hit, if debts piled, if their reputation cracked, the loan would be recalled instantly. Everything tied to Harrison Sr.'s empire would tumble like dominoes. I sat quietly folding the documents into the leather folder, my expression calm, almost blank. Inside, though, I felt the cool edge of control slide into place. They believed they had secured a lifeline. What they had done was knot a rope and hand me the other end. Back in the present, my phone buzzed again. This time the notification came directly from Project Brainrot's internal system. Clause 47C flagged. Potential trigger detected. My eyes flicked to Ethan. He was still ranting, red-faced, throwing desperate words into the air to reassert his control. Grace sat stiffly beside him, her gaze fixed on her plate, her silence as loud as any confession. My father adjusted his cufflinks, oblivious to the shifting ground beneath him. They had no idea. Not yet. I tightened my grip on the wine glass, letting its stem press into my palm. They thought the humiliation was mine. The failure was mine. What they didn't see was the chain already tightening around their world. And the best part, they had signed it themselves, convinced they were the ones teaching me how real deals were done. The first domino had already tipped. I walked out of the Harrison townhouse with the sound of muffled whispers still trailing behind me. The December air cut against my face sharp and clean, nothing like the suffocating heaviness of the dining room I had just left. My fingers still tingled from gripping the wine glass too tightly. But I didn't go home. I turned the car toward Union Square. There was one person I needed to see before the night was over. Rachel. We had met years ago in the halls of MIT, both of us surviving endless nights of coffee equations and whispered plans of who we might become. She was the kind of mind professors secretly envied, a living, breathing computer who could turn chaos into clarity. After graduation, she'd gone on to a career in financial forensics. She spent her life dissecting the kinds of empires men like my brother built, exposing the rot beneath their shiny facades. If anyone could help me build a structure Ethan couldn't touch, it was her. The coffee shop where we agreed to meet was quiet, tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat. Its windows fogged from the steady hum of the espresso machine inside. Rachel sat at a corner table, hair tied back neatly, a black binder resting in front of her like a waiting secret. "Olivia," she said, as I slid into the chair across from her. Her smile was quick, but her eyes studied me closely. "You look like someone who finally decided to stop defending and start attacking." She wasn't wrong. I pulled off my coat, letting the warmth of the cafe settle into me. "I need something airtight," I said quietly, leaning in so no one could overhear. "A system that shields me, but also positions me to strike when Ethan falls. He's arrogant, careless. When he stumbles, I want the entire empire to crash with him. But I can't have any of it traced back to me." Rachel tapped the binder. The cover was plain embossed with 2 words in stark white Nemesis Holdings. "This is it," she said. "A shell corporation offshore. Completely legal. Utterly invisible. Once Brainrot's assets are transferred, designs, patents, trademarks, you'll no longer appear as the owner. Publicly, you'll be a consultant. Privately, you control everything. And if they ever try to come after you, contracts will trigger penalties so massive they won't know what hit them." I stared at the words Nemesis Holdings. It didn't feel like a corporation. It felt like an inevitability. "I've already set the trap with the cross-default clause," I murmured. "But Rachel, this will wipe out my father too." He signed without reading. He trusted Ethan. Rachel didn't flinch. "Olivia, they've been erasing you since you were a child. Every deal, every slight, every Christmas morning. They handed everything to Ethan and called you a failure. What you're doing isn't sabotage, it's survival. And survival has consequences." Her words hit me hard, but they were true. I thought back to the scarf, the bike, the endless moments where my worth was measured in scraps. That tiny voice of hesitation I carried, still wanting my father's approval, faded with the memory. Rachel opened the binder and slid a heavy silver pen toward me. "Sign here. Tonight Nemesis Holdings becomes real. You'll have the clean break you need. Ethan can drag the family into ruin, but you'll be standing clear on the other side, untouchable." I picked up the pen. It was colder than I expected, its weight undeniable. For a second, I felt the years of silence pressing down on me, the ignored child, the mocked sister, the woman who had been laughed out of her own family. Then I pressed the tip to the paper. The ink spread in a steady line, my name bold and final. Rachel smiled, a rare, genuine curve of satisfaction. "Congratulations. You just built a weapon they'll never see coming. Legal, clean, and devastating." I sat back, exhaling slowly, the hum of the espresso machine filling the space between us. Outside, the snow had thickened flakes settling against the glass like quiet punctuation marks. I stood pulling my coat over my shoulders, ready to face the cold again. But just as I reached for the door, my phone buzzed. I glanced down. An encrypted message lit up the screen. From Grace. "We need to talk, tonight, alone." I froze under the glow of the cafe's yellow light. Grace, who had bowed her head and whispered boss in front of the entire family, was reaching out to me now. She wasn't just the fiancée caught in Ethan's orbit. She knew the truth. And now she was choosing to step closer to me. I stepped outside, the snow falling heavier, the city wrapped in silence. My pen stroke is still fresh. Nemesis Holdings, alive on paper, and Grace stepping onto the board as a new piece in play. The financial war was ready, and now the human betrayal was beginning. I sat in my Brooklyn office long after the Christmas dinner had ended. The glow from my computer screen lit the room, humming softly in the background. The anger in me wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind that explodes and fades. It was the kind that simmers for years, turning into something colder, sharper. I pulled open a drawer and took out a pile of old report cards and certificates. Most of them had Ethan's name stamped across the top in bold letters. But I knew better. Behind almost every one of those papers was a piece of my work, my effort, my mind. I remembered high school. I had spent weeks building a solar energy model for the science fair. Nights in the lab hands, covered in dust and wires, eyes red from the glow of soldering irons. The night before the presentation, my project was gone. I walked into the fair the next day only to see Ethan standing at the front with my model. He hadn't even bothered to change the design, just the name tag. I stood there while he presented my research, fumbling through the technical details he barely understood, yet speaking with the kind of swagger that carried more weight than truth. The judges applauded. My parents beamed. The golden trophy was handed to him, while I clapped with the rest of the crowd invisible. That night I told Mom what had happened. She gave me a soft, dismissive smile and said, "Don't be selfish, Olivia. Your brother needs encouragement. You'll be fine." It wasn't fine. And it didn't stop there. Years later in college, I was deep into AI research, part of a small team working on neural networks. Ethan came to visit one afternoon. I made the mistake of explaining a new concept I'd been developing. A week later, at a business reception, he repeated my idea word for word. I wasn't there, of course, but I heard about it after the praise, the internship offer, the congratulations. I was acknowledged only as the technical support behind the scenes. That was the pattern. Ethan didn't just steal credit. He learned to expect it, and the world learned to give it to him. Teachers, relatives, even strangers, everyone accepted that he was the heir, the leader, the one to celebrate. My role was the quiet one, the helper, the shadow. I thought back to another Christmas years after the bike. I had spent months weaving a shawl for Mom, choosing the thread carefully, matching the colors she liked. Ethan brought a perfume bottle from the mall, bought at the last minute. Guess which gift she paraded in front of the guests? She told everyone how thoughtful Ethan was, how successful. My shawl. She folded it away, thanked me politely, and never mentioned it again. It wasn't about the gifts. It was about the message. My effort was invisible. His thoughtlessness was golden. And Ethan absorbed that message until it became his truth, that all recognition belonged to him, no matter who had done the work. I stacked the papers neatly on the desk, hands trembling not from weakness, but from resolve. For years they had erased me. They had rewritten the story, so I was a supporting character in my own life, but not anymore. I whispered the promise I had once made as a lonely child, clutching a scarf in the dark. This time it wasn't a plea. It was a vow: no one will erase me again. My phone buzzed, pulling me out of the memory. A new email lit up the screen. The sender made me pause. Grace. The subject line was short. "We need to talk. Alone." I stared at it, my breath catching for a moment. Grace, who had bowed her head at dinner, who had whispered boss in front of them all, was now reaching out. She wasn't just Ethan's fiancée. She was someone who knew the truth. And for the first time, she wanted to speak to me directly. The financial traps were already in place. The legal weapon was loaded. But this Grace's choice to step toward me was something new, something human. The game was shifting again. The city was gray that Monday morning, the kind of steady drizzle that soaked into your clothes without you realizing it. I walked into Catherine Blackwood's office with that damp chill clinging to me. Her space was all glass and steel cold but commanding. Catherine herself sat at the head of a polished glass desk, sharp lines in her suit, sharper lines in her eyes. She didn't waste time with greetings. "Olivia," she said, voice flat and steady. "We have everything." On the table between us lay a thick binder. The weight of it was more than paper. It was months of watching, gathering, documenting. It was Ethan's carelessness printed and preserved. I slid into the leather chair across from her, my hands brushing the edge of the file. Inside were emails, recorded conversations, contracts that told the story Ethan thought no one would ever piece together. Catherine flipped to the first section. "These came from his burner account," she explained. "He and Lawson were discussing client data they had no right to touch. It's written out clearly, no ambiguity." I leaned closer. My own name jumped out at me on a project outline. Only it wasn't mine anymore. Someone had clumsily whited it out and replaced it with Ethan's signature. Catherine turned the page to a coded memo from Lawson. "Just make sure Olivia doesn't find anything traceable." My jaw tightened. For years I had suspected they weren't just dismissing me, they were actively erasing me. Seeing it confirmed in black and white was both sickening and strangely clarifying. Catherine tapped her pen against the page. "We also have Julia's recordings." She bragged about how her boss always finds shortcuts. That alone wouldn't stand in court, but paired with the logs we pulled, it's airtight. I nodded slowly. They weren't just arrogant. They were sloppy. Catherine's lips curved in the faintest smile. "And sloppy men are my specialty." We moved through the evidence. System access logs. Copies of NDAs that Ethan had once forced me to sign, which Catherine had carefully dissected. "These don't hold," she explained. "The clauses are unenforceable. He thought he locked you out. He actually left the door wide open." The dining room looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. The chandelier was still glowing above us, spilling light across the polished silver and crystal. Yet the warmth was gone. That golden light now felt like a spotlight throwing every flicker of discomfort into sharp relief. No one moved. No one breathed too loud. Ethan broke first. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and desperate. "Anyway," he said too loudly, his laugh brittle. "Let's not ruin Christmas. Tonight's about family, about celebrating." The silence that followed was suffocating. My father's knife hovered mid-cut above his steak, his posture stiff. My mother's hand went to her necklace, twisting it anxiously, her eyes darting between me and Grace. Sophie stared, openly, her fork untouched, studying me like she was seeing me for the first time. Grace kept her head bowed, her hands resting in her lap, her stillness louder than anything Ethan could say. I didn't answer. I just lifted my wine glass slow and deliberate and took a sip. The sound of glass touching my lips filled the quiet. Ethan launched into his usual script. Boasts about Lawson Inc., closing deals, a new house in the Hamptons, words I'd heard all my life. But tonight they landed wrong. His sentences came too fast, his voice cracked on certain words. He rushed his stories as though speed could hide the tremor in his tone. I set my fork down gently. The clink against porcelain was soft, but sharp enough to slice through his monologue. Everyone flinched. Ethan's head snapped toward me, his face flushed. He reached under the table for his phone. His fingers twitched as he unlocked it, trying to look casual. "Excuse me," he muttered, pushing back his chair. He walked quickly out into the hall. Through the doorway I caught fragments of his voice. Harsh, low, frantic. "Pick up. Come on. Answer me. Now." I knew exactly who he was calling his banker. The man he relied on to keep his wheels turning, the one who always bailed him out when he overextended. Ethan's voice grew sharper, more panicked, every unanswered ring tightening his nerves. He wasn't used to silence from the people who usually jumped when he called. When he came back, his smile was pasted on, too wide, too stiff. "Just a quick business matter," he said lightly, sliding back into his chair. But his hand on the table trembled, the clenched fist betraying him. It was the first time I had seen Ethan's mask slip so far. The golden boy, the family's pride, always so composed, now he looked trapped. His eyes darted around, searching for reassurance that no one could give him. My father finally spoke. Ethan, he said, his voice low, concerned, is something wrong with Lawson? Ethan forced a laugh. Of course not, Dad. Just a pushy client. Everyone wants something before the holiday. But no one looked convinced. Even my mother didn't echo him. She just pressed her lips together and looked at me. Grace stayed silent. She hadn't raised her eyes all evening, but the way she sat calm, composed, deferential spoke volumes. Every second she kept her silence was another cut into Ethan's authority. The man who had called me garbage was unraveling in front of the same people who once laughed with him. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He wiped it away too late. The room noticed. I leaned slightly toward my mother, my voice calm but loud enough for the table. Funny, isn't it, Mom, how silence tells you more than words ever could? Her hand froze at her necklace. She didn't answer. The tension broke when Ethan slammed his fork onto his plate. The sound was sharp, metallic, final. Enough, he hissed. His voice was low, almost dangerous, but his eyes gave him away. Wide, wild, frantic. He had lost control. I stayed still, my glass raised halfway to my lips, watching him, letting him burn in his own panic. Just then my phone buzzed softly against the table. I glanced down. A new message. Encrypted. From Grace. We need to talk alone. I lifted my eyes, meeting hers for the first time since she bowed her head. For a moment, just a flicker, we held each other's gaze. She looked away quickly, but I had seen enough. The silence deepened, but the balance of power had shifted. Ethan was floundering. Grace had chosen her side, even if she hadn't said the words aloud. And the rest of the family sat frozen, watching the unraveling of the story they had clung to for years. The dinner wasn't over, but Ethan was. I pushed my chair back slowly, the wood scraping against the polished floor with a sound that seemed to echo far louder than it should have. Every conversation, every breath in the room froze. The chandelier above spilled its golden light across the table, but instead of warmth, it felt like a spotlight trained directly on me. I held my wine glass for a moment, tilting it so that the ruby liquid caught the light. All eyes were locked on me, my mother stiff and pale, my father frowning in disbelief, Sophie, gripping her napkin with both hands, and Ethan, whose face was draining of color with every passing second. I let the silence stretch my breath steady. I had spent years biting my tongue, but this time there would be no hesitation. I think it's time to clear the air, I said, my voice even calm. I'm not just Olivia, the sister who brought a so-called garbage gift to dinner. The words hung in the air. I set the wine glass carefully back on the table, the soft clink ringing like a gavel. I'm the CEO of Brain Rot Gifts. That little box Ethan laughed at. It isn't a trinket. It's our latest prototype. And while you dismissed it as trash, our annual revenue has already crossed $8 million. The reaction was instant. Gasps rippled down the table. Aunts and cousins leaned forward, whispering furiously. Sophie's eyes went wide, flicking between me and Ethan as if she was watching two strangers. My mother's hands trembled as she reached for her necklace. Ethan's jaw fell slack. He forced a laugh, high and unconvincing. This is absurd. She's making it up. A little online shop? I cut him off. My eyes locked on him. Do you know what our clients pay for that garbage box? $500 minimum. Per unit. That landed like a stone in still water. The chatter rose to a frantic pitch. People stared at the walnut box in the center of the table as if it had transformed before their eyes. My mother's voice cracked as she turned to me. Olivia. 8 million. Truly. I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. Instead, I looked to Grace. She had been silent all evening, but her body language was undeniable. Her hands folded tightly, her gaze lowered in deference. She gave a small nod, and that was enough. Ethan tried to rally, his voice strained. She's lying. She's staging this entire thing to humiliate me. Grace, tell them she's... Grace's hand pressed flat against the table. Her voice, low but steady, cut through the noise. It's true. The room dropped into silence again, and it wasn't the silence of confusion anymore. It was the silence of recognition. The truth was no longer mine alone. It was acknowledged, undeniable. My father slammed his fist onto the table, the force rattling the glasses and silverware. His voice cracked with anger and disbelief. "Ethan, how could you?" He didn't finish the thought, whether it was about mocking me, about ignoring what was obvious, or about letting arrogance blind him. I couldn't tell. But the damage was visible in his face, his authority fractured in real time. I stood straighter, surveying the room. Their eyes no longer carried the old pity or dismissal. There was something else there now, shock, respect, maybe even fear. I turned to Ethan. His skin was chalky, his lips trembling as he searched for a defense that wouldn't come. "You didn't just insult me," I said, my voice low, steady. "You ridiculed the work of dozens of artisans whose craft keeps their families alive. You called something worth $1,000 garbage. You made yourself the fool tonight, not me." Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hands shook on the table. For the first time in my life, my brother had nothing left to say. And then the final blow struck not from me, but from the device he depended on so completely. His phone buzzed violently against the polished wood. The screen lit up the bold subject line, impossible to miss even from across the table. "Urgent. Bank account frozen." The blood drained from his face completely. His fingers fumbled for the phone, his eyes darting frantically across the message. His lips moved, but no sound came. I didn't need to twist the knife. The room was already watching his empire collapse in real time. I simply reached again for my wine, lifted the glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The truth was out. The carefully constructed facade Ethan had lived behind for years was gone, shattered by his own arrogance, and the consequences were only beginning. The first vibration of Ethan's phone had been a warning. By the time the second and third alerts hit the table, the room was no longer just tense, it was collapsing in real time. The soft chime of notifications sounded almost cruel, each one a hammer driving another nail into the coffin of the Harrison family's illusions. I leaned back in my chair, calm, while Ethan scrambled for his phone with trembling hands. His thumb slid across the screen, his eyes darting, his breath coming too fast. His face was drained of color. "What is it, son?" my father asked, his voice low, already coated with dread. Ethan didn't answer. He just stared, blinking hard, as though willing the words to rearrange themselves. I already knew what they said. The first email was from his private banker. Line of credit suspended until further notice. The second came from Lawson Inc.'s compliance officer. Data access revoked pending investigation. And the third, the one that forced Ethan to drop his fork to the floor, was from the family's primary bank. Effective immediately, Harrison Holdings accounts are frozen. The man who mocked me minutes earlier as irrelevant was now watching his entire empire evaporate before his eyes. My father pushed his chair back roughly, the heavy legs scraping across the polished wood floor. His phone buzzed on cue. He picked it up, and the change in his expression was almost theatrical pride falling away, replaced by raw panic. His cheeks went pale, his jaw slack. No, this can't be happening." He tried to recover, holding the phone tighter. It's a mistake. Some clerical error." But his voice cracked on the last word, betraying him to the whole table. My mother finally broke the silence. "Robert, what is it? Tell us." He looked at her, stricken. "The bank? They've frozen everything." The air was sucked out of the room. Sophie gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. Relatives shifted in their seats, whispering frantically. And Grace stayed utterly still, her eyes lowered as if she had always known this moment would arrive. Ethan shot up from his chair, nearly knocking over his wineglass. He started pacing, his voice shaking. "This is sabotage. Someone hacked us, Olivia." He turned on me, pointing a trembling finger. But his words died when he saw my face. I didn't need to speak. I just watched him, calm, unflinching, letting his paranoia do the work. "You're too quiet," he shouted. "This has your fingerprints all over it." My father snapped, his anger now fully directed at Ethan. "Enough. I trusted you, Ethan. You told me Lawson was solid. You told me those loans were safe. And now," his voice faltered, the weight of what he had signed pressing down visibly on him. "Now we're ruined." I placed my napkin gently on the table, the fabric folding in perfect silence. Then I rose. Every eye followed me as I straightened my coat and looked directly at Ethan. "You've mocked me all my life," I said evenly. "Tonight you mocked my work in front of everyone. But the only thing that's garbage here," I paused long enough to feel the words slice through the room, "is your arrogance." Ethan's face twisted, his mouth opening in protest, but no sound came out. I glanced at my father, then back at Ethan. My voice was calm, measured, and deliberate. "You have 7 minutes to explain this mess to your father before the next call comes through. Use them wisely." The silence that followed was heavy, final. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the black sheep at the Harrison table. I was the one holding the clock, the power, and the room itself in the palm of my hand. And Ethan knew it. When I finally closed the door behind me and stepped into the cold night air, I felt the weight of years lift off my shoulders. The muffled sounds of chaos from the dining room, Ethan's frantic voice, my mother's choked sobs, my father's phone ringing again and again faded as I walked down the steps and into the street. For once, I wasn't the one left behind in the shadows. I drove straight to my apartment, a place that had always been mine alone, built without their money or their approval. The city lights glittered across the river as I unlocked the door and walked into the calm, warm silence of my home. The first thing I did was open my laptop. The familiar dashboard of brain-rot gifts lit up, a soft blue glow filling the room. Notifications rolled in one after another: new orders, international inquiries, partnership requests. I scrolled through them slowly, savoring every detail. A major retailer in London had just placed a bulk order worth $500,000. A Tokyo-based design house wanted to collaborate on a limited edition collection. And the latest revenue numbers blinked on the screen, bold and undeniable: $10,024,673 year to date. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a long breath. The so-called garbage gift, the little walnut box Ethan had mocked in front of everyone, had turned into the foundation of a multi-million-dollar empire. They tried to bury me with laughter, but I had built my fortune quietly, piece by piece, until the numbers told the story no one could deny. Meanwhile, the Harrisons were unraveling. News alerts were already breaking across financial outlets: Harrison Holdings under investigation. Lawson Inc. freezes accounts amid data misuse inquiry. Images of Ethan leaving a downtown office, pale and furious, were spreading online faster than he could catch his breath. And Grace had already left. The last text I received from her was short, almost cold. "It's over. Don't contact me again." She had vanished from Ethan's side just as quickly as she had whispered "boss" at the Christmas table. The engagement was finished. The company fractured, the legacy destroyed. I stared at the screen, then reached for my phone. There was one more thing I needed to do. I dialed the number I knew by heart. My mother picked up after only 2 rings. Her voice was soft, worn down, but not angry, just tired. "Olivia," she whispered. "Yes, Mom. It's me." I paused, giving her time to breathe. "I think you should come live with me. I have an extra apartment in the building with a view of the river. It's quiet, safe. There's enough space for you and your book club if you want." On the other end, silence, then a small, shaky laugh. "You remembered my book club?" "Of course," I said gently. "I remember everything." For the first time in years, I heard something new in her voice: relief. Not pride in Ethan, not pity for me. Just relief that there was still a place for her away from the wreckage. I closed the laptop and walked to the window, staring out at the water. The city pulsed with life, indifferent to the fall of the Harrisons or the rise of brain-rot gifts. But I knew what it meant. Sometimes the things people call worthless end up defining everything. That little box Ethan laughed at was never garbage, it was proof. Proof of my skill, my patience, my refusal to stay small. Proof that revenge, when served quietly, can be more powerful than any outburst. I let the words settle in my mind, clear and undeniable. Sometimes the gift they mock becomes the symbol they can never escape. And revenge, true revenge,